The 696th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
Elton ready on his second attempt. That one is no good. They battle for it. Loose ball. Recovered Marvin. He scores. 17 seconds left. And he was fouled. Here we go. Lawson with a runner. No. The rebound. Hansbrough at the gun. Got it.
They were 4 for 24.
Hansbrough on a switch on Paulus. A deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Tipped away by Johnson. It's loose. Page. Johnson.
They're dancing in the arms. They're high-fiving. They're celebrating. They're going bananas on Franklin Street.
Pass to Britt, 15 seconds to play. Up high to Page, gets a screen from Meeks. Page driving in on the left, high off the glass for 2. 6 seconds to go. Pinson comes front court. Pinson to May for the win. Got it! Luke May! He got it! 0.3 of a second! Luke May gives Carolina the 75-73 lead. Are you kidding? Into Dixon. Boozer switches onto him. Dixon the kick. Trimble! Got it! And Carolina wins it!
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you guys on a Tuesday night. We're about 5 minutes, more like 10 minutes removed from a decision that we speculated would be coming down since UNC lost last Thursday to VCU in the first round of the NCAA tournament. It is now official. Hubert Davis will not return as the head basketball coach of North Carolina after 5 seasons on the UNC bench, after compiling a 125-54 record, taking Carolina to the 2022 Final Four and winning the 2024 ACC regular season championship. His 5 years have come to an end after Carolina blew a 19-point lead to VCU in the first round of the NCAA tournament, which was the largest blown lead in the first round of the NCAA tournament, to go along with blowing the 15-point lead of the halftime of the national title game, which is the largest blown halftime lead in the history of the national championship. This has been a storyline that we have been following very closely really since the game and the season ended on Friday. We knew this was very much on the table on Thursday, going into Friday, and this situation developed over the weekend, Saturday into Sunday, and on into the early part of this week. Felt like this news was going to come down tomorrow after they decided to not make this news official earlier in the day, with spring football getting started for Bill Belichick and that program. But we got basically a Tuesday night news dump right about before 9 o'clock. Inside Carolina was on it. Matt Norlander of CBS Sports, Jeff Borzello of ESPN. The list goes on and on to who has confirmed and reported that Hubert Davis will not return as the head basketball coach at the University of North Carolina. And we're going to spend the next 30, 45 minutes, however long we got to take, really just talking through this. Because as necessary as this move feels, it's not an easy day. It's never fun to see someone lose their job. It's never easy to see someone lose their job, especially one in the public eye, but especially someone like Hubert Davis that loves North Carolina, loves Carolina basketball. It was the honor of his life to serve as the head coach of this program, but after 5 years, he's been relieved of his duties, and now arguably the best job in college basketball is officially open, and a coaching search will begin in full earnest in Chapel Hill.
Yeah, it's a little bit shocking. We were sitting here just waiting to do the latest edition of the podcast, which was going to be an update on where exactly everything was standing and some of the new intel that had been released across some of the websites out there and our reactions to that. And now we get this huge drop, especially, great job by the people over at Inside Carolina. They were the first that I saw that had it. Greg Barnes was the first one to post about it. And so I give credit to them. They were on it, faster than just about anybody. But it's shocking. It's shocking to be sitting here and talking about this because, what's crazy is how quickly things changed. When you were sitting in that arena, if you were there in Greenville, there was a point where you thought, man, Carolina's moving on. Carolina is going to go to the round of 32. They're going to play Illinois more than likely in the round of 32. And I think if Carolina gets there, I think that Carolina, probably ends up holding on to Hubert Davis. I don't think this is a talking point by any stretch of the imagination. But from that point forward, the final 14 minutes or so of the game, until, he ends up going up there and having the press conference that he ends up having. I don't think any of us thought that this was where we would be. And now, this is where we're at, is that Carolina now is going to have a new head coach. It was one thing, I think, to say that they were speculating it, that they thought this was ultimately what was going to happen. But now as we sit here and we actually talk about it and we say to ourselves, this is for real. It's to me, it's almost just shocking to, think that we've gotten to this point, because we saw today, there was some pushback from former players. It started the other night with Larry Brown. Today it was Justin Jackson who had a firm pushback, and there was reporting from Inside Carolina that there were others within the program that were pushing back. This was sort of gaining steam, similar to what we saw with the arena decision after, a little bit of time, was that, some of the former players, some of the alumni, some of the big donors and stuff like that, there were some that were starting to push back on it. But, they end up making the move here to fire Hubert Davis. And I think, where I've gotten to is that it's the right move for Carolina basketball. It's a painful move. There's no doubt about it. I'm hoping that this is something that, isn't nearly as contentious as it was with Matt Doherty. And I think the one thing that you look at and you wonder, is it going to be contentious like that, is the fact that Elijah Davis has removed everything off of his Instagram page that involves Carolina, basically done a complete scrubbing of that. So you would imagine that there are some hurt feelings that are going on behind the scenes, but this is ultimately what I think had to happen for Carolina to get back to where they need to be as a basketball program. The last 5 years, we've had some ups and downs, but for the most part, it hasn't been what Carolina basketball is used to. Carolina basketball is not used to the ups and downs. They're used to the consistent ups, being one of the best teams in the country. And I think that the frustration had been growing, and it really culminated that night in Greenville, where Carolina ends up going down to VCU. And now, just 6 days after that ends up happening, we have the official firing of Hubert Davis.
And we have some quotes from the UNC leadership. Want to bring this to you from Go Heels. We've got comments from both current AD Bubba Cunningham and AD in waiting Steve Newmark, who will become the AD later this summer. First, we'll start with Bubba, and this was his comment on the matter. Quote: We appreciate all that Hubert has done for Carolina as a player, assistant coach, head coach, and community leader. He has helped make special memories we will never forget. This was not an easy decision because of Hubert's tremendous character and all he has given to the program, but we must move forward in a way that allows our team to compete more consistently at an elite level, end quote. As for Steve Newmark, he released the following quote: Hubert cares deeply for our university and has been inspiring to watch him instill that love and Tar Heel tradition into the players he has coached. Chancellor Roberts, Bubba, and I join all of the Carolina community in thanking Hubert and his family for all they have done for UNC, end quote. It also was stated that Carolina will honor all the terms of his contract. Remember, he was given a contract extension that was made public last year. Look, it wasn't a significant. I mean, his buyout was like $6.2 million, I think, is what the buyout figure was. He wasn't making a lot of money because he didn't want to make a lot of money, because he didn't need to make a lot of money. Would rather had more money to be made available for his staff, players, so on and so forth. And I agree. I think this is best for Carolina. The roller coaster cannot be tolerated. It can't. Not at a program like this that has, been to a Final Four every decade since 1940, has won a national championship every decade since 1980. You've got the Final Four for this decade, but you're closing in on maybe not having a national championship this decade, and that's where Carolina expects to be, is still playing basketball. You're still competing in the second weekend of the tournament, and beyond. And that just hasn't been the reality of the situation under Hubert. You had 2 first-round exits combined with missing the tournament altogether when you started preseason number 1. Can't happen. We argued and we made this point so much during the offseason that like 99% of the programs outside of Carolina in the ACC would have killed for the last 5 years that Hubert Davis put together. But at a place like this, it's not good enough. And I don't think Carolina was they weren't willing to relinquish their standards to appease the family and to appease a family hire. And that's why this decision has made, because this is going to spark, I think, the first of many changes that you're going to see to this Carolina basketball program and the way that we see it from where we sit right now. And look, because of our jobs, we were blessed to have a media credential this year and be in the arena. But the program that we got to cover so close this past year, it's going to look a lot different when we get into the Smith Center for whatever the next time we're there. And for me, that very well could be an introductory press conference for the new head coach. I'd love to be there if everything allows. But Carolina is about to undergo a major makeshift. They're about to undergo a makeover, because this move, and I'm not going to call it a firing, because I don't think they fired him. I think they just moved on from him. It's going to fire the break from the Carolina family. There's a 99.9% chance the next guy they hire will not have direct ties to Carolina. I know you see Sean May on some of these betting odds. I would be stunned if they made this move and Sean May does emerge as the head coach for Carolina basketball. But as necessary as I think this was and is for the program, I think this is what's best for Hubert Davis individually as well. And I say this because now, and look, did Carolina maybe take too long to make this announcement? Absolutely. We could have made this announcement yesterday. We could have made this announcement before 9:00 on a Tuesday. But had they gotten to the point where they ran it back, right? And let's just say we entered next year and Hubert Davis was the head coach, and you could have sold me on that on Thursday night. You could have sold me that on Friday when I said I didn't want him to not have the job. He would have been entering a legitimate make or break year where next year could have been like Final Four or bust. And if it doesn't end well, then it's a public termination, and you're dealing with some of the stuff that you dealt with Matt Doherty. Here's the difference between this situation and the Doherty situation. Matt Doherty had earned the right to be fired. He had done 36 games in 2 years, and he was running the program into the ground as much on the court as much as he was doing so off the court. For all intents and purposes, that's not been what's happened under Hubert Davis. Has there been some friction? Sure, there has been. This is a different time in college athletics where players have more power than ever before. And you've seen some players voice their frustration when they've gone on to different places. We've seen parents kind of voice their frustration when their kids go on to different places. But Hubert wasn't making a mockery of the program. He wasn't making a mockery of what makes Carolina basketball Carolina basketball. It still felt special when you walked in that building and you watched this team compete. And no one loves Carolina more. Like, he was the perfect successor for a guy in Roy Williams who, during his 19 years on the bench, loved Carolina as much as anybody could love Carolina. Hubert Davis, during his 5 years, loved Carolina as much as anybody could love Carolina. He talked about how the job was his ministry, and it was his place of service to serve players and serve the community. And I think he lived that mission, man. I think you could tell there was a service attitude to the players. There was a service attitude to the community that in a different time, in a different era, meant more than winning basketball games. And 40, 50 years ago, Hubert Davis's job would not have been on the line because the way he handled himself off the court was just as important with what he did on the court. Just not where we are in modern college athletics. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but when there's as much money that's involved, when there's as much business as involved, winning is the most important thing. And the 125-54 record would suggest he did not win enough, and that's why Carolina is making this move. And they're going to honestly conduct the coaching search they should have conducted 5 years ago and find the right man to lead Carolina basketball into its next iteration as this sport continues to evolve in the NIL and transfer portal world.
Well, the thing is that you look at Hubert Davis, he should have been the perfect hire for Carolina. This should have been the guy that ended up working out for Carolina because of how much he cared about the program, because of, the ties that he had to the program in terms of being a player and being a successful one, and the time that he had spent out on the bench as an assistant to the head coach that we love so much in Roy Williams. And he wanted to blend that ability of Roy Williams with what Dean Smith brought to the program. And he wanted to bring certain principles from both guys and really combine them into the way that he coached. And I think on paper that was great. That was certainly something that we wanted as Tar Heel fans. We thought that was the way to go. But unfortunately, in the landscape of college basketball, that just doesn't seem to be what's winning right now. And I think that's the thing that people have to understand is that, yes, the Carolina family, the Carolina way of thinking and everything like that is still very important. It's still very important to us. And we are hoping that whoever ends up being the next coach is going to buy in to that way of thinking, is going to be someone that, is the same demeanor of a guy like Roy Williams, a guy like Hubert Davis was, where he's the ultimate nice guy when it comes to just about everything. But when he's on the court, he's the ultimate competitor. That's what, Carolina basketball is hoping to find in their next head coach. But, you thought that, man, you had it in Hubert Davis. And I go back to that first year, and I really think that a lot of us probably thought after that run, in that moment, we probably thought, man, we've got the next guy. this is going to be the guy for the next, 20, 25 years, however long he ends up wanting to coach. And even though, the regular season wasn't great that year, I think there was a moment where we all thought that because you were in bliss. You thought, man, especially after that game in the Final Four against Duke, you thought this guy in his first season has taken us to the brink of a national championship. It can only go up from here. And since that point, it really has not been what we thought it was going to be. I mean, you've talked about the lack of regular season success in terms of where it needs to be. I mean, Carolina's seeding in these NCAA tournaments has been unacceptable. Even going back to that first year, when we gave him some grace, we said, hey, that's year one. It is what it is. It's going to take some time for you to be able to build and learn on the job because you are a first-time head coach at this level, especially because he had been a JV coach. But we knew that things were much, much different, that it wasn't going to be easy for him to just take over and immediately pick up where Roy Williams left off. But I think that's the worst thing that honestly could have ended up happening to him, was that he did make that type of run and set that type of expectation, because that became what Carolina fans were expecting of him pretty much immediately. You then have preseason number one expectations, where Carolina fans, get incredibly excited and think, hey man, we're gonna be able to run this back with this group, and this is gonna be a group that's gonna lead us to a national title. This is gonna be somewhat similar to 2017, but without the redemption aspect necessarily. And unfortunately, that just never really materialized for Carolina. They end up missing the NCAA tournament. I mean, that's something that we would have never thought we would see in our time as Carolina basketball fans. And so, that's really how you got to this point, and how you've gotten to the conversations about moving on from Hubert Davis. And I think, when you look at his quad one record, that's certainly something that I think you have to look at and say that, Carolina just couldn't win the important games under him, especially after, they made that run in the NCAA tournament. It just seems like even when they got into the NCAA tournament, they weren't. I said this, when we were recording, I think a few times ago. We've been recording so much it doesn't even, they all kind of run together. But the success in March hasn't necessarily been there, which we thought that was going to be his specialty. We thought that was the one area where he was for sure going to be able to succeed, was in the month of March, because he did it in his first year. That was just where his teams were built to have the most success. And then you have that year a couple of years ago where Carolina wins the ACC regular season title. You're a 1 seed. You're feeling like, man, Carolina's building towards something great here. This is going to be a run to the Final Four, something like that. This is a team that has the right parts, and they end up falling short in the Sweet 16. And so even that moment, when you look back on it now, is probably one of the reasons why we're sitting here today having these conversations. But, it ultimately comes down to he just didn't win enough when he had to. I think that's, the sad part is that we all wanted this to be the guy for Carolina, but that is not necessarily the case. And I think now, as you said, Carolina is going to be able to conduct the search that they should have been conducting probably the first time around. They should have at least looked at certain outside candidates and seen whether or not that was a better fit for where Carolina was at, especially if there is any sort of truth to what we talked about the other day, which was the rumors from Jeff Goodman, that he says there are sources telling him that Hubert Davis never even wanted the job. Well, if that was the case, then Carolina should have definitely looked outside and seen if there was anybody else that sort of fit this job a little bit better. I don't know how much I believe that, but I mean, you do wonder, until we find out from, Hubert Davis what it ultimately ended up looking like behind the scenes, you do wonder if there was an element of that because of, the way that Hubert Davis seems to be about himself. He doesn't, come off as the most confident head coach and everything like that. So, yeah, I do kind of wonder if that was part of it, if he felt like he was taking this job on, and that, maybe he wasn't qualified for the job. But you never know ultimately what ends up coming out. So we'll have to see whether or not that was actually the case. We don't have any reporting from any Inside Carolina or Tar Heel 24/7 that would tell us that is the case. So maybe that is nothing. But it is interesting to wonder, was this just a little bit too much for Hubert Davis when he ended up taking the job? And that's part of the reason why we're sitting where we're at here today.
We do have a statement from Hubert Davis that's been posted as well. This to his personal Instagram feed. It's just a post with the following quote: "Tonight I was let go by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My desire was to continue to coach here. This opportunity has truly been such a blessing. I thank Jesus literally every day for giving me the opportunity, relationships, and experiences with the kids and my staff. I am very proud of what we were able to accomplish together. My goal is to coach again in the very near future." End quote. The very end of that is really, really telling. Because I never would have thought that he was going to want to coach again. He got into coaching to coach at Carolina, and then only wanted to be a head coach at one institution. But as much as he loves that opportunity to serve kids, and he feels like that's his calling in life, maybe he and his wife are comfortable continuing to be in a coaching in a coaching relationship where it's going to be somewhere outside of UNC. I'll tell you this, it'll be difficult. It'll be hard to see him coach somewhere else. It's not something that I want to see. Now, if he wants to join, Wes Miller's staff at Charlotte, or maybe go up to Monmouth and coach with King Rice, I think that would make it, an easier pill to swallow. I know there was some scuttlebutt about trying to find a different role with him within the university and maybe keep him on in some sort of role once the coaching transition took place. That was never feasible. What you saw happen with Virginia Tech football and Brent Pry is one of the odder situations in sports, where he was fired as the head coach but was retained as the defensive coordinator. And I think it'll be good for Hubert to maybe get away for a little bit, and let some of the toxicity kind of die down, and kind of let this situation kind of resolve itself. Because I do think that, you look at Hubert the person, he's as easy a guy as there is to root for. I don't know if I've ever interacted with a more genuine, good human being than Hubert Davis. I got the chance to meet him back when I was in 9th, 10th, 11th grade. We stopped at Chapel Hill the day of the Duke Carolina game for senior day. And he was in the Carolina Basketball Museum hanging out. And I got a chance to take a picture with him. It's my profile picture at different times, sometime on social media. And then, with the radio station, we've had a chance to have a couple interviews with them at ACC tip-off, and it was always genuine. It was always real. He was open. He was honest when it was easy to ask the easy questions, and even when we had to ask some of the tough questions. I think what makes it even easier to remember his 5 years is look at the 2 wins that he has that will live in Carolina lore. And it's really 3 when you count the Seth Trimble shot this year against Duke, because it gave Carolina their first close, real buzzer beater, if you will, over their arch rival.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll never forget the win at Cameron to close Coach K's final home game as Duke's head coach. And we'll never forget the 2022 Final Four win that sent Carolina to the national championship game. And those may be Roy Williams' players. with the Brady Manic transfer influence in that starting lineup. But the head coach of that team was Hubert. And you look at the two decorated Tar Heels we just got done celebrating after 5-year careers. They were Armando Bacot and they were RJ Davis. Guess who was their coach the majority of the time? It was Hubert Davis. And I think those two guys that feel like the last real linchpin, and of course we got Seth Trimble of like forever Carolina guys. Well, they were coached by Hubert, and they were able to accomplish some really special things individually under Hubert, as well as collectively under Hubert, getting that 2024 ACC championship that really had me saying the last couple weeks, and whenever we had this conversation about his job, he's proven that he's capable. You don't do what he's done unless you're a capable head coach. You just don't. You don't get to the Final Four by accident. I know many people will argue that Kevin Ollie did, that he just rode Shabazz Napier's coattails to the Final Four. But you can get to the Final Four and then win the Final Four. You got to be capable of doing it. You don't win a power conference regular season title unless you're capable of coaching at that level and winning the games that it requires to do so. It just wasn't consistent enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we were willing. I know I wasn't willing to lessen the standard, to lessen my expectation in the name of, well, he's a nice guy, he has to stay employed. And I don't think Carolina as an administration was willing to do so either. When you factor in this is new leadership, this is new guidance with a new chancellor and Chancellor Roberts. You've got a new AD on the horizon with Steve Newmark. And we also know that Carolina's got some big decisions coming up. They've got to figure out what they're doing with their arena. And we know that Carolina is planning an exit to leave the conference where they have all their history and their tradition as soon as 2030 and go join a conference more likely than not the SEC, which is the last 2 years has put the most teams in the NCAA tournament. So you cannot afford to keep falling behind if you want to be able to keep up with your peers. And look, Carolina beat their peers on the court this year. They beat Kansas, they beat Duke, they beat Kentucky. And look, Kansas and Kentucky are both home from the NCAA tournament, but we're behind that school 8 miles down the road. And I'm not going to say that it's not close, but the gap's pretty big. There's a sizable gap for where the Duke program is and with where our program finds itself at right now. And I do think that played a role in this move as well. Duke's, on the verge of maybe going back-to-back Final Fours with a young head coach, with their succession plan post Coach K. We thought that we had the guy post Roy Williams when Hubert Davis took us to a brink of the national championship. Like, if they get that rebound, there's a very good chance Carolina cuts down the nets and they win the national championship. It just did not pan out that way. And now we're sitting here on a Tuesday night talking about this job becoming open, something that there has been speculation around really since his second year, when Carolina started preseason number 1 and missed the NCAA tournament. That's when the doubt set in. And the next year they responded. They get a 1 seed, but they lose to Alabama in the NCAA tournament. Carolina shouldn't lose to Alabama in basketball, and let alone in a elimination tournament setting. But that's the team that sent them home. And then last year, you're preseason top 10, and you're literally the last team into the tournament field. And a lot of people believe you only made the tournament because your AD was on the committee. So look, we knew all summer that every loss was going to be a referendum on his coaching status, on his job security. And I think we knew as we made our long walk back to the car last Thursday and we drove back from Greenville, South Carolina, that it felt like we had just watched the end of the Hubert Davis era, and that nail in the coffin was made official earlier tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had gotten to that point where, I mean, we were discussing it on the way back. And as someone that entered the arena on the fence about what to do with Hubert Davis, leaning more towards keeping him, even if Carolina did end up losing this game, I think it was just the way that everything went down. The fact that you were up by 19 and you let VCU come racing all the way back. And it felt like there were things that Carolina could have done in that moment, that Hubert Davis could have done in that moment to help Carolina out. There were timeouts that were, that should have been taken at certain times that just weren't taken by Hubert Davis and his coaching staff to try to quill the run that was going on. And we saw that, in the game against Duke. We saw that in the game against Clemson that ultimately led to the 3-game winning streak at the end of the year, where there were moments where Hubert Davis, it felt like, could have done something. And he sat back and chose to do nothing in those situations. And I think that's why you are where you are at. When your team looks like it's worn down, in that game against VCU, as you're getting ready to come down the stretch, I mean, there was a time where you could have subbed with 12 minutes or so left in the game. Let's bring some fresh bodies in here. Let's get these guys refreshed and have them back out there for the stretch run. I know you were nervous about the backups potentially, the guys that are part of your rotation potentially giving up a little bit of a run, but you had built some trust in some of these guys. There was a reason why some of these guys were playing as you came down the stretch of the season. And so it would have made sense to leave those guys in or to put those guys in and ultimately, take the guys that you feel like are most valuable to you, a Seth Trimble, Henry Vassar, even a guy like Jaron Stevenson, who played some of the most minutes that he'd played all season long and just looked worn out. It would have made sense to put those guys on the bench for, even a TV timeout to TV timeout stretch where you go maybe 4 minutes, 5 minutes with those guys off the court, and then you're throwing them back in there for that stretch run. I think that would have made sense and could have potentially quilled the run that VCU would ultimately end up making. So I think that was some of his undoing towards the end, was that his decision-making, what some of the issues that we had said were, popping up from time to time, they all seemed to happen at the same time. It really brought to the forefront all of those mistakes, and it seemed to all be happening right in front of us at the same time. And then you go into that press conference, and I think that was really what sold it there, because then, this was as standoffish as of a press conference as we have seen. Before, we got on here tonight, I was watching the guys over at Tar Heel 24/7 that were talking about it, just to see if they had any sort of new updates on what was going on. And they said that, and I didn't realize this because, didn't listen to the press conference after the game against NC State. I think that was one that we were just all trying to kind of flush. There were a lot of people that thought that press conference was worse. So maybe that was really the start of it, where it felt like Hubert just didn't have any answers left in the tank, that it seemed like he was running out of steam. He says that he's not. He says that he wants to coach. He wanted to continue to coach at Carolina. I think that answers my question as to whether or not he wanted the job or not. It seems like, yes, he was very motivated to take the job at the time when he got it, and he's very motivated to continue the job, as of earlier this evening. But, I think when you get to that point where it just feels like you're giving answers that are basically, I have no answer to your question. I don't know what the answer is to turning this thing around. I think that was ultimately where you reached that point where it felt like there was no return. Now, in terms of the stuff that you brought up about, him making the run and everything like that, there are people that try to take that away from him. I've seen, plenty of Hubert Davis, opposers that have said, look, man, you can't give that run to him. Those were Roy's players. You got to give him the credit for that run. Guys, he wasn't the one that was coaching them out there. As much as I love Roy, and I'm willing to give Roy credit for just about everything, and you have to give Roy credit for getting some of those guys on campus, Roy was not there coaching those guys out there on that floor that night for Carolina against Duke or in the national championship game against Kansas. And so, I mean, look, man, he deserves a ton of credit for what he did in his time at Carolina. We talk about Roy Williams as a guy that's on the Mount Rushmore of the sport. I think, we have the arguments all the time with fans of college basketball about that part. We have arguments all the time about with Carolina fans about whether or not he's the greatest coach to ever coach at Carolina. We believe that he is. There are plenty of other people that disagree with us. At the same time, Hubert Davis deserves credit for that run because he did an unbelievable job of getting that team. I mean, you coached one of the most unbelievable games that we have seen in Cameron Indoor Stadium against Duke, where Carolina ends up winning 94-81. I mean, that was a game that nobody saw coming. We thought maybe Carolina can find a way to pull a massive upset, but to really dominate that game for most of the way and control that game for most of the way, that really spoke to Hubert Davis as a coach, getting his team locked in and focused and getting his team motivated when it said, dude, coming into that game, they're not even talking about us. Like, we remember, College game day and everything on that day. They didn't even mention that Carolina was the opponent but a few times. And they did not do any sort of in-depth talk about where Carolina was at. This was a Carolina team, by the way, that was kind of on the bubble at the time. I mean, remember, before they end up winning that game, Carolina's probably a 10 seed in the NCAA tournament. And the fact that they were on the bubble, they still didn't talk about Carolina. It was all about the Duke Blue Devils and the fact that this was Coach K's final game in Cameron Indoor Stadium. It was about how this is going to be an absolute blowout. There's no way that Carolina is going to be able to compete with them. And they came out and won that game. And then it was basically the same thing when they got to the Final Four. First of all, getting to the Final Four was crazy. We do criticize, Hubert. One of the things that we brought up was that, you had a 25-point lead against Baylor. You allowed them back into the game. Carolina still won that game in overtime. He was able to get his guys energized, and they were able to take over in that overtime period and be able to advance. He deserves credit for being able to lock those guys back in that overtime period while also facing some criticism for allowing Baylor back into that game. But then the rest of that run, I mean, Carolina, found a way to win some games that they weren't expected to win. And I'm not saying that, look, it was the hardest path that Carolina has ever had to a title, but every, obstacle that Carolina had placed in their way until they got to that Kansas game, he was able to navigate, including the most pressure-packed edition of the rivalry with the Duke Blue Devils in the Final Four game, where, again, as I said, you were doubted. There were a lot of people going into that matchup that said, you still don't have a chance. Yeah, you beat him in Cameron Indoor Stadium, but how motivated is Coach K going to be to get back at Hubert Davis, to get back at this Tar Heel team and find a way to get themselves to the national championship game? And Hubert, on the biggest stage, ends up coming up huge and out-coaching Coach K and finding a way to get Carolina across the finish line in that game and get them to the national championship game. And then you talked about it. They were on the brink of winning a national championship if it wasn't for the floor giving away. If it doesn't give way on Armando Bacot, who knows if Carolina ends up winning that national championship. I'm not saying that's the reason that they ultimately lost that national championship. I think the big part of it is that they didn't have nearly as much depth as they probably needed. But, part of that was just, it was year one. That was a group that was just kind of pasted together, by Hubert Davis, by a first-time head coach, and he led them all that way while not having that much depth. So he deserves a ton of credit for that. That's how I'm going to remember Hubert Davis, the coach, not what the end of his tenure was. I'm going to choose to remember the good things about him. But I feel like, as we sit here tonight, we both said it, that we feel like this is just a necessary change for Carolina, and one that hopefully will bring them back to being the blue blood that we're used to. Because you talked about Duke. Man, Duke is a mile ahead of where Carolina's at. Kansas is ahead of where Carolina's at. I'm not going to say a mile ahead, but they are still ahead of where Carolina is at, even with some of the recent struggles that they've had since winning their national championship. And Carolina's where Kentucky's at right now. And that's not a great spot, man. Kentucky's toying with the idea of firing Mark Pope after, basically mutually parting ways with John Calipari just a couple of years ago. And so, that's not the area that you want to be in if you're Carolina. You want to be competing with teams like Kansas, like Duke, to be those powerhouses year in and year out. And I'm hoping that's ultimately what Carolina is getting back to, because that's the standard that we have for this basketball program.
There's no denying that my relationship with Hubert Davis as a Carolina basketball fan, complicated. I fired him at 15-5 in his very first season. I went on rants last year when he was wasting when a great all-time Carolina player, one of my favorite heels of all time, RJ Davis, his final season was not being maximized in the way that I would have hoped it would. And then this past year when we had the West Coast road trip and you looked bad against Stanford, you looked bad against Cal, that led to me voicing some frustrations. But I'm come to the defense of him, and this is going to be something that we're really going to learn just how committed Carolina is to winning. Because, I'm listening to the Eye on College Basketball podcast. I'm going to try to get Chip Patterson on this podcast. What you're talking about from the moment he was hired was not supported financially in the way that you need to be supported financially. You're talking about a year after winning an ACC regular season title and having less money made available than a program like Iowa State, because the people that control the money no longer didn't believe in him after what he did in 2022, what he did in 2024. Now, the argument will be made that they gave him $14 million and he lost to VCU, but the context to that conversation is you lost your best player. And before you lost your best player, you were 19-5, and you were ranked number 11 in the country, trending towards being, at bare minimum, a second weekend of the tournament type of team, which we also made it very clear that was not meeting expectations. We're not here to make the Sweet 16 to be happy. We want to advance past the Sweet 16, past the Elite Eight, and on to the Final Four. But we're going to find out the financial commitment that Carolina basketball has, because you're going to have to pay a buyout to Hubert Davis, although, as I mentioned, that buyout is not overly significant. And they're going to conduct and they're going to go bring in a big-time head coach. This job is going to attract the biggest names in the sport. And there will be some people in the NBA that will show some interest in this job as well. That's how big this job is in the basketball community. And so you're going to have to pay top tier for your head coach, which you weren't doing with Hubert. He was like the 52nd highest paid coach in college basketball. I don't care how many endorsement deals he has, and he doesn't have as many as Roy Williams has. Optically, the head coach at North Carolina should not be the 52nd highest paid coach in the sport. There should be a top 3 salary with the head coach at the University of North Carolina. If you can pay Bill Belichick $10 million to go 4-8, you can pay your basketball coach what the basketball coach should be making. But also, we're going to find it also comes down to making sure the funds are available on a year in, year out basis. And that's the one thing I think we're learning more about, the funds weren't always made available to him the way that they need to be made available in modern college basketball. I'm not saying you got to have $14 million every single year, but if you're not giving the next head coach coming in at least 10 to 12 mil, guess what? We're going to be doing this in 5 years again. And that cycle is going to change until the spending gets regulated. And we don't know when regulation is going to come to college athletics. I think it's going to happen at some point. I think at some point we'll be having some sort of collective cap that all these teams operate under, but we don't know when that is. And the fact that, after what happened this year, there was fundraising concerns going into next year, quite simply isn't fair. The money people that are that fund the program cannot act this way with the next head coach. You need to give him his money, or you need to no longer be associated from a funds perspective with Carolina basketball. It's just that simple. Duke has no problem having the $15 to $20 million made accessible every single year to build their roster. Neither does the people at Kentucky. They spent $22 million on their roster. The people at Kansas, we know what they spent, to get Darren Peterson, to Lawrence, and the list goes on and on. So this is going to be, I think, a gut check time for Carolina basketball and the powers that be behind the scenes, the guys that you don't see, but they're the guys that are standing there in their quarter zips, and drinking, but before the game. Those are the guys that are somewhat responsible for where Carolina is, because if we had, if he was given $14 million every single year to build the roster, do I think we'd be sitting here right now? I do not. But this was also, and we don't know how much of this was Hubert Davis. We don't know how much of this was Carolina as an athletic department. This is what happens when you're slow to really embrace NIL the way that NIL has been embraced. When you're slow to embrace the importance of the transfer portal, having a GM, having a front office put in place, like this needs to signal a complete overhaul in the way that Carolina basketball operates. The thing that you have to keep intact, and I hope that they find a way to keep intact, are the core principles that make Carolina, which is playing hard, playing smart, playing together. Because one thing that I worry about, I had this conversation with my father, had this conversation with our boss, Colin Hoggard, who I know is a listener to the show and is a diehard Carolina fan. The Carolina basketball program that we know, the Carolina basketball program that we love and that we worship, has a chance to look unrecognizable within the next 5 years, because you're going to have an outsider coaching the team, and you're going to have a new arena that could potentially host Carolina basketball. That's not the Dean Dome. It could be named the Dean E. Smith Center. It could have Roy Williams' name on the floor. But, the new head coach has probably got to be on board with this thing getting moved to Carolina North, or maybe to the Odom Village, something like that. And that's just another change to a program that for 65, 70 years has stood the test of time and has shown that it's our way works. Because if it didn't work, we wouldn't believe in it. If the Carolina way didn't produce wins, you're talking about since Dean Smith, you're talking about over 1,600 wins for Carolina basketball. You're talking about countless Final Fours, national championships, how many banners hang in the rafters of the Smith Center because of the way Carolina operates. I agree that it needs to be overhauled, but I do worry that this could be a program that loses its identity. And if it loses its identity, you know what it's going to lose? It's going to lose a portion of the fan base. And I'll compare it to this. Baseball has never been the same since 1994. When they had that strike, it cost them the World Series. Let's just say Carolina moves on from a beloved member of the family. You bring in an outsider, and this, for whatever reason, does not work. You have a potential to alienate your fan base, and that's something that I don't want to think about, but we have to be open and honest, is on the table. Because if this administration is hushing out Roy Williams, if this administration is not wanting to hear the voice of reason from the Carolina family, and we know that's true with what they did with the arena, they look at the mess they've made of Carolina football, and just the disaster and the fiasco that they did with the Belichick hire in terms of how they got there, and then all the stuff that happened off the field leading up to his first season. I'd hate to see that happen with our most storied program, our most successful program, and the program that most Carolina fans associate themselves with. Because when you think of Carolina, when you think of Chapel Hill, you think of two things. You think of the old well, and you think of the Dean Dome and the Carolina way. And the Carolina way, for the first time, post Dean Smith, post Roy Williams, is going to be put to the test like no other.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest thing is that you don't want the board of trustees being the group that ends up making the decision on the head coach. That's what ended up happening when it came to the football side of things, which, of course, that doesn't have the history that Carolina basketball does. And yeah, it's been a complete mess. So you're hoping that is not what's going to end up happening. You're hoping this is going to be a decision that is going to be made by Steve Newmark, Bubba Cunningham, and the input of the Carolina family, the input of Roy Williams. That would be the guy that I would say you want to get input from. Hey, we're going to interview a lot of these different guys. We would love for you to be a part of that coaching search group that we're putting together. And we want your opinion on who you think outside of the family is going to be a fit for Carolina. And look, I don't know if Roy's going to be open to it. Roy may be like, go scratch. I'm staying on the golf course. I'm staying out of this because the guy that I thought that was the best for this program, you guys just fired. But I do think that you have to at least offer that up to him and say, look, we want you to be involved in this process. We want you to be a part of the committee that picks this next head coach. And so I hope that he will be involved in that. I'm hoping that whoever is taking over this program is going to embrace the Carolina way and can eventually be someone that becomes a part of the family. Because you go back to, Roy's assistants that he brought in. Not every one of those guys was tied to Carolina. Not every one of them was tied to Dean Smith. These were guys that eventually became tied to the Carolina way because, they were taught about it. And they really bought into it. I think that's what you're hoping that you're going to get from a new head coach. Is there a guarantee that that's going to happen? No. I think that's certainly something that makes you feel a little uncomfortable. And I think rightfully so, because, I want the balance of somebody that's going to come in here and bring some modern day principles, bring some modern day, spark to this program, but at the same time isn't going to change everything that we've become accustomed to, is going to want to continue to live by the words of play hard, play smart, play together. Those are things that I really think you need in the next head coach. And so there's going to be somebody out there. I think there are guys, in the coaching profession right now that probably have a great deal of reverence for guys like Dean Smith, and especially for Roy Williams, because a lot of them, if you go with the younger guy, a lot of them grew up watching Roy Williams and probably do look at him as one of the best coaches of their generation, one of the best coaches in the history of the sport. And so I think that's what you're trying to look for. You're trying to look for that marriage between those two. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. That's why they've got to go through this process. I think it's certainly got to be something that's relatively quick, but hopefully they've already been behind the scenes talking about this here over these last handful of days, and they've started talking maybe to some camps, in terms of the coaches that they could possibly hire, seeing who's interested, and then they can roll through some of these interviews pretty quickly. Hopefully that's the way they're going about it to find that next head coach that's coming in here. But I think part of it is that you also have to bring a little bit of an open mind that things are going to change just a little bit, that everything's not going to be the exact same way, that It's mainly, I mean, it's the money side of things is what's going to be different. I think that's the best point that you brought up right there, is that you need to get on board with the fact that you are going to have to pay your head coach a lot more money than any of the coaches that you have been paying in the past. You didn't have to pay Dean Smith a lot of money. He was not one of the highest paid coaches in the sport because that was just the way that he was. Same thing with Roy Williams. Roy Williams coached for the love of being the coach at Carolina. And that was the reason why he wasn't necessarily as highly paid as he probably should have been. And Hubert Davis was the same way. You're not getting that type of guy this time around. You're going out, you're getting one of the best in the sport, so you've got to pay them like that. And you are 100% right. I am the guy that leads the coverage for the football program on our website. I'm the guy that is the host of the football podcast for the podcast network that we have. If you can pay the football coach $10 million, then you better be willing to pay the basketball coach, which is the sport that carries this university. There are other sports that are very successful on campus at Carolina. There are other sports that have had even more success than Carolina basketball has had. But the sport that carries this university, that people know this university by, is the basketball program. You better be willing to pay that coach the amount of money that he is wanting. And, from everything that we've seen, from some of the reporting that's been out there, they believe that they are not going to have trouble doing that. But ultimately, it is up to the people that have the money. We can sit here as guys that, host the podcast. Guys, we're part-timers. We don't make the money to be able to fund the athletic program. It's up to people that are out there that have the types of money that we've seen be invested into other programs around the country. We know there are Tar Heel boosters that have that type of money. Well, now you got to put your money where your mouth is. You can't be one of those boosters that is complaining about the state of the athletic department, that is complaining about the state of Carolina basketball, and then not offering up the money to be able to get one of the top coaches in the country and be able to fund a roster that top coach is going to want. So we're entering a very interesting time in Carolina basketball. I think that we're going to learn how much of an appetite is there for Carolina basketball to be great. Because if these donors are not willing to put up the money, then we know that the appetite isn't nearly as strong as we think it is, which would be a pretty sad state of reality.
Yeah, I don't think you fire someone that's as universally loved like Hubert is if there's not a greater sense of commitment behind the scenes, if there's not a desire to win at a higher level. Could be wrong. But and per his statement, with his desire to still continue to coach here, this wasn't a mutual parting of the ways like we thought it was going to be. This is, they're not going to word it as a firing, but that's what this is. And that's not what any of us wanted. I never wanted to think about Carolina having to fire him. I would much rather just been a mutual split. But that's usually not how these things ultimately work out. And that's really unfortunate. So, but you're right. This is uncharted times for Carolina basketball. And look, we can look back on this and from 5-10 years from now, when we're still doing this podcast and we've been to Final Fours and won national championships, and look back on this differently. And that's ultimately my hope. I hope Carolina is able to lure the big name that this job requires, that this job demands, and this person comes back, and whenever his time it comes to an end, he becomes an adopted member of the family. And then we have someone groomed and ready to go to be the next guy that has ties to Carolina, because I never thought we'd be here. I never thought that we'd have to find someone with non-direct ties to lead this program. It's something that I never wanted. It's I like this program will never lose me. It can't. This program's been my life since the 6th grade. It's why I have the career that I have. It's why we have the blog. It's why we have the podcast. So I'm not gonna not cheer for whoever Carolina hires. I know who I want, and we'll do that tomorrow. We'll do that edition of the podcast tomorrow. We'll put our list together and then start going through it. But I'll never cheer for someone like I cheer for my own, like I cheer for my family. If I didn't go to school there, but so much of my identity is in that place. And so when there's someone that has ties there coaching it, I'm going to cheer for them a lot easier. I'm going to cheer for them a lot harder. And I was cheering for Hubert Davis. I was begging, I was pleading. My prayers to God were, God, let this happen. Make this work. Because I didn't want to have to host a podcast like this or do the podcast we're about to do in the coming days. Where we're and I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be great content. I think it'll be different because we know they're not hiring someone on the staff. But I wanted Hubert Davis to be the coach for 10 to 15 years, and then Wes Miller come home or Marcus Page get promoted, and the cycle just continued. And that's not going to happen. Marcus Page still might be on the bench next year, but he's going to be working for a different man, and not the man that helped guide him to a national championship. So it's sad. I think that's the best way to put it. This is a sad day, as necessary as a day as it is. This is a sad day for Carolina basketball. This is a sad day for the family. We'll see how public and messy this thing ultimately gets. I hope it doesn't get too far. We've already seen, Caleb Wilson tweeted out, "Thank you for everything, Coach Davis. One of the best men and coaches in my life." I think you're going to see some other former players coming to the defense of him as well, and I hope that's the case. And I hope Hubert walks away with his head held high. Just because you got fired doesn't mean you failed. He didn't fail. Like Matt Doherty failed. I don't look at this as a failure. I look at this as, I guess, a misstep, if you will. There's nothing from the Doherty era outside of him recruiting the nucleus of the 05 team that Carolina fans want to live and talk about. There are things from these last 5 years that we will live to talk about. I can't wait to have kids of my own, and when they ask me, "Daddy, what was your favorite Duke Carolina moment?" Well, let me tell you about this time Carolina went to Cameron and won a game in front of 90 former Duke players. Let me tell you about this time they met on the biggest stage in college basketball, and Caleb Love hit a shot. That happened under Hubert, and that can never be taken away from him. And so I hope he can walk away with his head held high and be proud of the work that he did. Did he accomplish what he set to accomplish? He did not. But he still did some real big things and some memorable things that'll live on through Carolina fans and through this program as we do enter these uncharted times. Anything else you think we need to cover before we do get out of here? Because this obviously will trigger reaction to the coaching search, who we want, what that coaching search looks like, so on and so forth. Before we cut this thing off, because we've got a pretty big crowd with us, do you think we've covered everything we needed to cover here tonight?
Yeah, I think if we're going to be given the list of guys that we ultimately want tomorrow, which I think is the right thing to do. I mean, we're an hour deep into this podcast. I mean, if we're going into that, we're going to be going at least maybe 2.5 hours deep into this. And, the other thing is it'll give us a little bit of time to sort of research the guys that we ultimately want. There are some names that immediately popped into my head, when we started having this conversation back on Thursday. There were some names that I think really stuck out and we think would make really good, coaches here at Carolina, would make the most sense in the modern landscape of the sport. And so I think that's right. But yeah, I would just want to hammer home, the point that you made there again at the end, which is that this should not be a day that is celebrated by Carolina fans. Yes, there is room for excitement. And that's the thing that I think you need to realize is that you can feel excited about the fact that you're going to have a coaching search. You can feel excited about the fact that there is a new day for Carolina basketball and that there is hope on the horizon. That's what every job opening usually brings to the table. But at the same time, you should not be celebrating the fact that Hubert Davis lost his job, that this is that he's finally out and that Carolina, ends up having to fire one of their own. I think that's the main thing that you got to make sure that you're doing tonight if you're a Carolina fan, is remembering the good times under Hubert Davis, the success that he was able to bring at certain points during his tenure, and especially that run. That title, that run to the national championship game where Carolina ultimately falls short, and everything that was involved in that, those two big wins against Duke, that's what you should remember about Hubert Davis. And, I'm hoping that it isn't going to be overly contentious, that this is something that is going to be able to be mended over the years and hopefully relatively quickly. But right now it's fresh, and it's going to be really hard to expect that Hubert Davis is just going to be okay with this, that his family is just going to be okay with this. And that's, certainly something that is an element of this. But, to the guy that said earlier, I think his name was Steve Blue or something like that. He said earlier, why do you went on for 10 minutes about Hubert Davis. Why even bother? It was the right move to get rid of him. He means nothing to this program. That is just completely false. That could not be further from the truth. He is not a guy that I'm going to remember as a failure. He's certainly not going to be a guy that I remember in the same light as a Matt Doherty as a head coach. And so it's a necessary day for Carolina basketball, but it definitely is a day that has me feeling sad for Hubert Davis and his family, because I think all of us, as Carolina fans, we're rooting for this to work out. But unfortunately, we have to turn to someone outside the family to get Carolina basketball back to where it ultimately needs to be, which is atop the sport and competing for Final Fours and national championships.
With that, folks, that's going to wrap up this edition of the show. In the meantime, we will direct you guys to the website. That's heeltoughblog.com. That's where I'm heading next to put an article up about this news. Probably should have had it pre-written and ready to go, but with all the different reporting, was waiting for something official to be made because didn't know if Hubert was going to come back because there was some momentum starting to grow for that earlier today. But there will be an article up about Hubert Davis and exit from the Carolina basketball program. And then tomorrow we will not delay. We will get right into the coaching search big board, putting up the candidates that I want, that I would target for what I believe is the best job in college basketball, the most prestigious job in the sport, one of the most prestigious jobs in all of college athletics. So a bunch of content coming your way on the basketball side of things. Of course, with spring football practice underway, we will keep you updated as well. So all that great coverage for Carolina basketball, Tar Heel football, that's heeltoughblog.com. As for the podcast, you know where to find us if you don't know. All you have to do is search the Four Corners Podcast and we'll pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any audio editions of the show. If you're a video consumer, if you're new to the podcast here tonight, and you're just checking us out for the very first time, but you like what you heard, you like what you saw, the best way to keep up with us on the video side of things, like and follow the Facebook page at Heel Tough Blog. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Heel Tough Blog. Or if you're joining us on Twitter, follow me on Twitter at HTB_Josh. Follow him on Twitter at HTB Anthony. The links are posted to both of our accounts. The second we go live, you can be notified. Y'all can jump in and be a part of the conversation. Did want to shout out the chat once again. It's been lively from the very beginning. Way too many for us to come through here on a Tuesday night. But just know that your comments are seen, they're appreciated, and we thank all of y'all that joined us here on the drop of on the drop of the hat, for to be right here and be with us here talking about this news that Hubert Davis is no longer the head basketball coach at the University of North Carolina. But with that, folks, it is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for both watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.